All right, let's go through some events. Now, for me, these are the parts where JavaScript shines a bit, because now we can get into all that event-driven stuff, which Node.js is very event-driven. Actually, Node.js, when we get into it, is a server-side technology that actually said, hey, we like what the browser's doing with that, all these, driven type of interactions, and, we need to borrow from them. They actually borrow a lot from the event model on the browser, which is was very innovative at the time. Actually, really hasn't been done. But yeah, we're going to get into events. So this is the cool part, right? We had static. No longer do we need to really talk about static web anymore, which is, for me, yeah, that was, it gets a little stale to talk about static data and static web, but now we can add this events to things, right? So things now can be event driven. So we can actually interact with the page there. You can see there's a button. You can just look at the image there. When you click that button now, that'll trigger an event, some event internally in the page. An event will occur, and then it'll run a piece of JavaScript. So then all that function work that you've done, we spent all that time on. Now we can trigger stuff. We don't have to do the page reload all the time. We don't have to refresh the browser, and we don't have to run it through a REPL and run it a playground, and we can, Fiddler or whatever one we're using. Now we can have a page that can be dormant until somebody does an action, and then it kicks off a whole bunch of stuff. Could be as simple as an alert. Could be as intense as, going through some secure checkout or submitting your order through some kind of what do they call it then? Moneris secure pipeline to deal with your credit card information, and then you wait. All this interesting stuff, right? You can really get into. That's where this stuff shines. So the event is an action that occurs in the web browser, which the web browser feedbacks to you, so you can respond to it. In this example here, we click a button on a web page. You may want to respond to this click by displaying a dialog box. But like we said before, there's many more things you could potentially do with that action. Really, it all depends on your requirement or imagination. Really, if you could build a game, or you could do something like trigger a transaction with Bitcoin or something like that, right? You need a trigger, and you need an interface. Thus far, all we had was a flat interface. Now we can actually add logic to things. So if you look at an airport, a series of fortunate events, you may have a guy sitting there giving the signal for the plane to take off. So in this example, there's an airport where there's a runway is clear for takeoff. A signal is communicated by the pilot, and then as a result, the plane can take off safely. So events are actions or occurrences that may happen in your system or when you're programming. Again, when we talk about events, it's not just it may not be, when you really get into this whole paradigm, it's not only just events that are triggered by the user. That in itself is something, but there are all sorts of events that can happen in a programming application or system. You may have internally some things that run that you need to respond to. Maybe there's like, it could be something like a scheduler that runs and then notifies everybody of some change in the data stream. All sorts of types of things. To be honest, if you're thinking about, when we talk about Node.js, which is really cool, the server-side stuff, it may be downloading a huge movie file, and it needs to trigger when the file is downloaded, and then you can respond to that event. When the file is finally downloaded, you could kick off another thing that actually goes and retrieves it and plays it, or gives some report or whatnot on certain things. So there's all sorts of event types: internal events, user events, external events I imagine that can happen between services. So, you know, there's a lot to it, right? But the system may produce or fires. So fire an event, a trigger, fires a signal. So signals some kind where an event occurs, and provides a mechanism where an action is automatically taken. So this is when some code is running. So something fires, you know, a mechanism captures that or is listening, and then based on the correct listener will fire some code when the event occurs. So you can get into some really interesting, cool things. You can have many types of listeners that maybe listening for a certain thing to happen or a series of events, and you may go off and trigger a whole bunch of things. But we're talking about the web. So we're going to talk about web events. We're not talking about server events, although server events in Node.js are mighty interesting because there's a lot of powerful things that can happen. But with the web events, we're more thinking about the interface. And when we're talking about the web page, we're talking about the browser and how it interacts with that document object model. So in the case of web events, they're fired in that browser window and tend to be attached to specific items that reside in it. So you may have a single element or a set of elements. You may have a button. You may have as simple as we've seen with a button click. You may have the window scrolling. You may have the page loading event and unloading. You may have keyboard input, things like that, hovering. There's such things as we'll look at today, like focus and unfocus. So as you're dragging that cursor across, you know, the browser knows the location of what, you know, you maybe now that we understand all of our HTML elements and our DOMs, you know, maybe if we hover over something, we can track or attach a listener to that certain, whatever it is. Maybe it could be a div section where you have some very important information that if the user kind of focuses on it, you can make it highlight. So you can do all sorts of stuff like that. So you can do really crazy stuff. You can, you'll see. I mean, you'll see when we do our lab, it gets interesting. Some cool stuff too. So you can actually make some really nice, if you were in that mindset, you could actually make some really nice games. Not just forums and kind of business, kind of interfaces or some type of, banking software. You could also make some interesting games with all the stuff you've learned, actually. CSS, HTML5, all that animation actually, I'll show you one of those things one day, what I actually made. We'll talk about it a little bit. Getting off track. Web events. So many types of events can occur. So if the user selects a certain element or hovers the cursor over a certain element, so if we had a drop-down select and we select something, we can trigger things off of that. We hover off a block of code. We choose a key on the keyboard. We can not only test for key presses, but we can actually target in on certain keys. We can also, very easily, I'll give you an example. Why not? Because it's a live example. Let's go to that site that I know. So when somebody is interacting with this text box, as you can see here, oh, sorry, that's something. As you can see here, you may not see it, but just clicking inside of the box will change the style of it. It'll actually, well, it should, but it didn't. we have some work to actually, when you click in it, it actually fades a little bit. But as I type, you'll see that placeholder go away. And then as I type, you'll see a type ahead. And then, well, let's do that. All right, so Lego. So you can see now I have a type ahead. At this point, I can either, and there's listeners on this text box, I can either hit enter, or I can scroll down and do a select. So there's triggers off of that, and they both respond in the same way. So if I don't, you can't see me, but if I actually hit enter, it would actually kick off a submit. And again, you can visualize this whole page now as a series of events here. There's lots of events going on, whether it be checking some of these check boxes or hovering, as you see now, as I just kind of hover, the cursor changes from an arrow to a hand, and then as you see that overlay happens, right? That quick view. If I click on that, that action triggers a pop-up. right? And then I can actually close this, or I can do something else with it. So this whole page is alive with event listeners waiting for user interaction. Even when I'm scrolling, actually, you know, it'll actually respond. You'll see like there's an arrow to go up, to go back up, right? So some really cool stuff can happen. That's a real life example, so I just wanted to mention that to you, just so we're not reading text. But right, so other types of events that can fire the user, you can actually listen to when the user resizes or closes the browser. You can, when a web page finishes loading, you may want to do something with that. When a form is submitted, which is a lot of which is one of the building blocks to like a web interface, is understanding how to capture all that information. Otherwise, what's the point of having forms, right? Videos played, pauses, finishes. I'm sure YouTube has a whole bunch of triggers based on that, whether or not to play an ad or whatnot. Whether an error occurs, we haven't really dealt with that, but if you know how to handle errors, you could actually, you know, respond in a very nice way. Instead of giving the red, if you don't know what that is, there's some errors that happen, like 500 errors, 404 errors, and those are kind of nasty errors. You never want a user to see one of these errors. 500, 400 error, right? You never want to see this kind of error happening on a website. This is not good for your user, where you get that page is not working. Google actually has a nice friendly one, right? It's a broken computer trying to fix himself, Android or whatever robot is, right? You know, maybe you don't want to see this. This is actually, yeah, something like that. You'd rather see a nicer screen, something you could handle it. So what I'm saying, these kind of errors, there's different types. There's a 404 error. Yeah, so you never really want to come across the raw screen, the raw error, which happens quite a bit. You may need to, you know, trigger some logic if an error happens. And how to do this is you need to set up some event handlers now. These are called handlers. So each available event has a handler, which is a block of code, usually JavaScript function. Remember our functions now. Now we have a purpose for our functions. In fact, one of the reasons why you might want to use a functional expression is because you may want to create that function, whether it be something like trigger, you know, submit transaction. You don't want that. You remember we talked about hoisting with function name, function declarations. You may not want that function way up to the top to make it global. You may want it just kind of quietly sitting there until triggered, because it does a lot of important things. So you may have that block of code that only runs when an event is fired. So it may be a very important function, or there may be a series of important functions that only need to be fired in a sequence. So when a block of code is run in the response to event, we say we are registering a handler, an event handler. But it also is called a listener. And you heard me call things listeners. So maybe, you know, you can think about, there's actually a concept called a delegate, delegation and things like that. But anyways, that's kind of a harder concept, but we could think about, thing that really kind of got me to understand that concept is you just think of, if you've seen that before as a kid or whatever, there's a string, and then there's two tin cans in the middle, and you put it to your ear and you can talk through it, and the other guy can listen on the other end, like it's a makeshift kind of phone. That's what you can think of. It's like a listener, right? It's listening for something to come along that channel, or an action or something to be triggered, right? So we may call it event listeners, and they're pretty much interchangeable when we're talking, but if you ever get caught up, maybe the more academic way of saying is handler, but you know, you'll hear listener quite a bit, and that's kind of what it is, because it listens, the listener listens for events happening and then handles the code that's run. So it hears it and then it runs the code, it handles it, the code that's run in response to that event from that happening. So event handler, also known as a listener, it listens to events and executes when the event occurs. So you may have something simple like this. We have, not simple, but straight, it's one HTML element. You have a button with an ID, again, importance of an ID in this situation is we need to grab onto it because we want to give some logic to it. So this is a good reason why you might want to put IDs on your elements. So you define it, and when the button's clicked, you register an event using this add listener method. So in this logic here, we grab that ID, and we grab the button ID, and then we define a function. That function here, display, doesn't necessarily need to be underneath it, but it could be anywhere. Again, if you have a big application, it could be anywhere in that in the file. It could be hoisted at the top, which maybe you don't want. But anyhow, you add a listener. So you're basically taking that element, and each node element has, because we're dealing with the document object model, it has wrappers to all of these, not wrappers like Drake, but like wrappers around them for all these methods. And we have something called add listener. We have some other ones that are similar, but add listener basically lets you define by reference when the action click happens, it triggers that display. It triggers that invocation for you. So it does the wiring up. So now basically you have a living version of that button sitting there that is ready to be triggered. But an example is worth 1,000 words. I wish I could get this minimized so I could see my desktop in a better way, but there we go. Let's take a look at this for a second here. So we have event handler, and we may have that example here. I think it's a button. So let's take a look at this. All right, so if I click it, my expectation is there will be a method there. So if you see it clicked, right? So now we don't really have to, worry about triggering a page reload. We have a function behind the scenes that will only trigger when I click that. So if you see that again, I could actually put, when we learn it on hover, we'll turn that arrow to like a hand cursor, but I haven't done that, right? So we trigger that. So what does that look like? I have a lot of examples today, so bear with me. So it looks like this. Now again, I put my script tag in the bottom because again, we may need to have the DOM loaded for us to execute this, right? So you may find in your labs that if you're putting at the top, it may not run because it executes up here, right, in the header tag. So it's perfectly fine if you do inline script for now. We'll clean it up. We'll clean it up later. Ideally, we should have things in the in a separate file, but for now it's all right. And because there is also certain when we learn the page lifecycle, there's certain events in the page lifecycle where handlers should be wired up, but we haven't learned that yet, and there's no point really confusing the situation right now. So we're basically, when we put it on the bottom here, we are saying that the page is loaded already. So the page is loaded already. We're safe, right? Page loaded after this, so we know that this element will be there, and we'll be able to attach a listener to it. So that's all it is. We have this button here, and we have an ID. Again, remember, we're using this query selector, and that's right, we're grabbing that button, and we are with that button. Here we have a function. Again, this function doesn't matter where it is. It could be here, or it could be here, but because it's hoisted, right? It's not a constant variable, so it doesn't really matter where it is. But the main point was these two lines here. You grab that, and you can certainly chain these methods as well, but really what we're doing is we're getting that object, and we are attaching a listener. We could do this all in one line, I imagine. If we wanted to be more explicit, we could do something like this, but for readability, it's your style, I guess, if you want to be very explicit about it. Right, so that's what that is. Let's see what this other one was. Did we talk about event flow yet? I wasn't sure. Let's see, no, we're talking about event flow now. And actually, we're going to talk about events actually first. Let's actually break it up here, and I'll get my Scottish friend to talk a little bit. Let me know if you can't hear this.
All you need to launch a cult skate brand, honestly, As long as you have a look.
Yo, what's going on, guys? You're watching JavaScript for Beginners lesson 39, and in this video I want to introduce you to JavaScript events. Alright then, so far we've been directly typing JavaScript into this console right here, yeah? And we've been firing that code ourselves by hitting enter when we've written something. For example, I'd write some kind of function here. Let's just do an alert for now. And then when I click enter, it's going to fire that code and we get the desired result right there. Okay? But in reality, when someone views our web page, we want that code to fire when certain things happen or when some condition is met. And these things are called events, and there's literally tons of events going on all of the time when somebody goes onto your website, right? For example, if I hover over this logo, that's an event. If I click this little icon, that's an event. If I click anywhere on the page, that's an event. If I scroll down the page, an event. If I hover over that button, that's an event. These things are going on all of the time when somebody views your page. Now, it's our job as JavaScript developers to write code that reacts to whichever of these events that should trigger some behavior. All right, for example, I used JavaScript to write this drop-down menu right there. So I said in my code that when this little icon is clicked right there, I want something to happen. So I said in my JavaScript code, when they click this, drop down this menu. When they click it again, bring up the menu. That is two events happening and two actions firing as a result of those events happening. I wrote that in the JavaScript, right? Essentially, I wrote a piece of code or a function that will do something when a particular event happens. Now, how do we write these events? Well, you can write them directly into your HTML. For example, I could say something like, in here, add an attribute. Let's just edit this HTML. I could add an attribute here and say on click, that's the event name, equals alert, you clicked me. Alright, and we could do something like that. Let's just get out of here and try it out. Now we get the alert, you clicked me. So we can add events to elements that way. However, I don't like doing that. I think it's messy. It clutters up your HTML. I think HTML and JavaScript should ideally be kept separate where possible. And imagine if you had some kind of bigger function that you wanted to happen when this was clicked. You're not going to want to write loads of JavaScript in your HTML. And again, if you had the same event happening on multiple pages, much like this, I have this on every page, I won't want to write it on every HTML page. I just write it once in my JavaScript code and then load that code into every page. Alright, so it's much easier to write these events or to react to these events in a JavaScript file. Alright, so how would we do that? Well, each element that we get in the DOM has these event properties. And there's loads of event properties. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them. I'm just going to go through a few here, right? But essentially, how we do it is grab an event out, sorry, not grab an event, grab an element out of this HTML code, right, that we want the event to happen to. So for example, let's just get rid of this. Let's edit the HTML. We'll get rid of the event there. And let's say we want to add some events to this h2 right here. Okay, the first thing we need to do is get that h2 element and store it in a variable. All right, we know how to do that. We'll create a variable, var, and we'll call it title equals document.get elements by id. Oops, wrong one. .get elements by id, and then the id is page title. And now we've stored that in a variable called title, right? Now this title now has access to all these event properties. And like I said, there's tons. We can have click events, mouse over events, load events, literally far too many to do a course on, right? What I am going to do is leave a link down below to a web page where you can see all those events. But for now, I'll just go over a few. And I'll say the on click event. In fact, if you write on, and you're in Google Chrome developer tools like me, you'll see a list of loads of different events that we can have here. All right, they're all on something generally. So what we'll do is an on-click event, and that's saying when someone clicks this title element, I want something to happen. Right? So how do we write what happens? Well, we assign this a function, right? So we say it's equal to a function. like that. And this here is what's known as an anonymous function because it's not got a name. Normally, we'd give a function a name, wouldn't we? You've seen that when we've discussed functions in the past, but in this case we don't need a name because we're just assigning this function to this onClick event. And you might notice that we've got this semicolon at the end. That's because this is a statement right here. When we normally declare a function, we don't have this semicolon, but because this is a big statement with the assignment operator, we have to put this at the end. Alright then, so let's write this function. So I'll say that when this is clicked on, I want to alert you clicked me. And you can have whatever code you want in here, right? You could have code that swirls this around, zooms it off the page, makes it fade out. You can do whatever you want to do with this element in here. I'm just keeping it simple. Alright, so now we've added that event, dead simple, click enter, and that function has been attached to this event. So when I click on this now, we're going to get this alert. I'll press OK. I can click again, get that alert. Okay, cool. We've attached that onClick event to this element right here. And we can attach other events too. Let's do a title dot on mouse over. That's another event. And this is an event which recognizes when you place your mouse over the element. All right. So I'll say this equals a function and an alert will pop up again, and I'll say you hovered your mouse over me, winky face, dirty talk there. Alright, so let's save this and let's try it. There we go, you hovered your mouse over me. Okay, you hovered your mouse over me. Okay, click one's still there, you clicked me. Awesome. Alright then, so they are JavaScript events. There is another way to do this, and that involves event listeners, right? And it's a method called add event listener. Oops, thought I was typing then. Add event listener. Just like that. And this takes a few different parameters, but for the sake of this course and playlist, I'm not going to go into this because they still have a few browser inconsistencies, particularly when we're dealing with Internet Explorer 8 and below. Alright, so maybe in the future when I do advanced JavaScript courses, I'll include that in there, but for now, I think you'll be fine with the...
Alright, yeah, good thing you mentioned that. There are a couple ways of assigning it. The preferred way is nowadays with more modern browsers is to use the add event listeners, but you can certainly, as you see, just assign it directly to the onClick with a function. That's perfectly fine as well. But when we get into some of the DOM levels, there's a reason why the preference right now is for that. But again, it doesn't matter. There's a couple ways you can do it. You could put it inline as well. You could do that as well. There's 3 ways to do it, but there's one preferred way, best practice over all the other ones. But we'll get into that. So we do have a lot to go over. So let's keep going through it. So we want to talk about flow, because before we get into those events, there is a concept of flow. Big word there, ubiquitous. I can't even say it. In JavaScript today, for example, so the concept in JavaScript today, there is a big concept of flow. When we talk about React, there's a one-way data flow. Yes, they're very big on the one-way data flow. It just goes one way, and then it gets out in a different way. Flow and node and DOM events and DOM flow are all vivid manifestations of flow. But yes, there's two-way data binding, one-way data binding. When we get into all these frameworks, each of these frameworks have their own way of dealing with this. It's actually pretty cool. You know, it's very interesting if you work with Angular or you work at React, they handle these things differently. On that side note, I was actually very pro Angular for a long time, and now I like React much better, to be honest, because React allows you just to use the JavaScript you've learned. You don't have to worry about learning another language, and you can just leverage all the work that you put in here without having to learn another language. That's what's really great about it. But as for the specific concept of flow and terminology, flow, this is a more academic term. Flow is an abstraction of input and output devices from a programmatic view. Streams are directional data, right? So if you look on the right there, and that's kind of a React flow. You have a parent component and the data flows down to the child component. However, you'll notice the data does not flow up. There's another mechanism that gets data out of it, and it's not, to be honest, it's actually events. You push data down, but you only use events to bubble it back up. It's interesting. It's very interesting. It's fast. It's very popular now because of the speed. Okay, so we have this container here. So when we click the button, you're not only clicking, right? So when this is the event flow. When you click the button, you're not clicking only the button, but the button's container, the div, and the whole page. So this is theory now, and it gets a little strange, but there is a concept, and I wanted to include this. This is more theory, just so you understand what's going on, because it's really for JavaScript. There's an order of things that happen here in behind the scenes. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on that you may not, when you get into programming JavaScript, it takes a while to understand this, but it's a lot of events firing in the background. So event flow explains the order in which the events are received on the page from the element where the event occurs, and then it propagates through that DOM tree. So initially we just knew that tree: window, document, body, div. But when you click on something, it bubbles up, it goes downwards and it goes upwards, right? There's like a unidirectional flow happening. And there's two main concepts to this model. There's bubbling and there's capturing. And it is something to take in for sure. I did have an example on flow here. And there was an example on event type as well. Let me see what this one was here. So this one was, it's just a button there, it's not very exciting, but if I actually were to look at my console here, when I click it, it's going to show me that I click the button, you click the body, you click the document, you click the window. So it is actually respecting all of that. I'm console logging. When I click a button, it's actually bubbling up, bubbling up, bubbling up, bubbling up. So I have a button down here. It's going to the body. It's going to the document. It's going to the window. They're all aware. They're all aware of that click. So if I click it, you can see there, you click the body, you click the button, the body, the document, and the window, which is very strange, right? What's happening in there, to be honest. So what I did is I used I didn't add event listeners. So if you can see here, I added on clicks to each one of those sections here. So I grabbed the button by the ID, which is this ID here, click me. And then I attached on the button, the body, the document, and the window, a listener. And the listener basically runs that autonomous function. So now I have 4 listeners listening on each node, and they're going to capture the fact that there's a click going on. And when I click that bottom button, all 4 are going to fire. And that is super weird, but that's what happens internally in JavaScript. It can cause many problems, but again, we already established JavaScript is weird, right? So again, if we looked at that DOM tree, we may be clicking this element here, but the body will listen to it as well as the document, as well as the window container. So it is very odd. It is very odd. So but it takes a little bit to getting used to be honest. There's different things that happen, and you may need to stop some things going on. So let me take a look at this also. So there's a concept of bubbling. So bubbling sounds like what you would think, a bubble that just kind of floats up to the top. So in this model, there's an event starts at the specific element, like our button, and it flows upwards. So it bubbles to the top. Again, this is happening without you even knowing it, right? In behind the scenes, you may not even run into the problems this may cause unless you're really coding a lot. There are some very apparent things that happen though. So it'll go upwards towards the document, upwards towards the window. So when you click that button, the click event occurs in the button. If there was a container that contained the button, so we didn't have that container, the body, the HTML, everything has a click event fired against it, which can be very problematic sometimes. Yes. Sorry, I can't hear you. Your microphone is really bad. I get some weird feedback there, so I don't know who is that, but sorry, I couldn't hear you at all. That was on my end, I hope. Right, you can type a question there in the window if you have one. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut that off, but I could not hear you at all. So yes, I'll continue. Right, so
Mike,
yes.
Quick question. The flow thing is damn cool, but is there an example to see the flow from window document and I mean the downwards flow?
The downwards flow. So we'll talk about that in a second because there is a counter to the bubbling in the next one.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. These are weird concepts. This is the theory part. Now, this is the theory part that's, you know, the exam theory portion will probably cover some of this stuff, but it's very good to know about this stuff. It'll make sense to you when you need to use some other syntax you'll come across and you have no understanding why we use it. This is why. So we have that bubbling going up, right? So we have the click event triggers, so occurs the button from which the element was clicked upwards, right? So the click event goes all the way up the DOM tree. So for events, it goes all the way up, firing on each node along its way, reaching to the. That's called bubbling. Modern browsers, the bubble event goes up to the window object. Some of the older ones handle it a little differently. They go to the document. But on the other side of it is the capturing. So in the event model, an event starts at the least specific element, flows downward towards the most specific element. So when you click a button, the click event occurs in the following order. This is capturing now. It's trying to capture it as it's going up. So it goes the other way. Document, HTML, body, button. So you may not be able to grab onto this with the capturing, but it basically goes the other way. So if I can show, so capturing goes downwards. So we're trying to capture that effect in a way. Capture the element and then bubble it up to the top. So there's just a lot of weird stuff going on here, but you can't tie into the capturing as far as I know. You're mostly listening for the events happening. Right, so it is actually, that goes back to the original diagram here, that there's a capturing phase that happens, and then you can see it here. It starts to try to capture all the elements. As the event happens, it bubbles up to the top. But it is a kind of a two-way. Now, when we talked about two-way data flow, this is not a two-way data flow. When we talked about Angular or React, those are totally different mechanisms. Those are frameworks that, with their two-way data binding, it's very apparent. I could actually show you a really cool. I'll have to dig it up. Right, like it's very cool. We don't have that because it's not built into the vanilla JavaScript. We have this. This is internally. The browser does this right now. These other frameworks come up with their own thing to kind of solve some issues with this and give you some really cool stuff. Like as you're typing in a text box, the DOM is automatically listening and you're changing things like on the fly without any other functions or anything. It's pretty awesome. But we're dealing with vanilla JavaScript, so we don't have those features, right? But we're getting there. When we learn React, we'll actually look into data binding and cool stuff like that. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. It's a big kind of concept, but you may run into some syntax. And let me see this one here. This is event types. So did we talk about the event object? We may get into that one here. If I click this one. All right, let me look at this one here. This one was an event type. So what this is basically saying, okay, well, we're going to get into the event object itself, but what this is demonstrating is that you can have an anonymous function. Like this can actually be, and I'm using a listener here, right? This could be an anonymous function like this. And that's fine. But when you set something up like this, you have, and you may have seen this in code before, you have access when the event happens, you have access to the event itself. So you can actually grab onto it. Just internally it knows if you put a parameter here. Now, normally you'll see this like this. It'll just be an E. You may see it in many documentation, it'll just be an E. Now that could be, the event could have been an exception and you're trying to handle it. Or in fact, it's just capturing that event, and you can drill into that event. And there's lots of different properties on that event, and we're going to get into that event object in a second. But this is demonstrating that it's the same setup as before, but now that anonymous function will take a parameter called event that you don't need to worry about. It'll automatically internally pass in that argument, whether or not you include it or not. If you include it, maybe it's an error. Maybe you need to get the type or what happened, and you may need to log that or respond to it or trigger something else or do whatever in your data flow. But just know all these handlers has access to this parameter internally, so you can inspect what happens. And maybe you don't need to inspect it, and maybe that's fine. For instance, for a click operation, you don't need to really know what the event type is, but if you did, that's what it would look like. It's basically giving us information back on the click. What else can we look at? There's a whole bunch of stuff. I just looked at the type, but if we wanted to see, I don't know, is it cancel? Could we cancel it? Could we cancel? We could actually look at that. The type, the timestamp, the target. Yeah, this is a normal one actually. The target, you could actually look at the target of where the event was fired from. So it actually gave you the whole button element. So internally, it's basically giving you back the element that it was fired on. That's pretty cool. You needed to manipulate it some. Other properties like is it canceled? Like, can you cancel that event for some reason? I don't know if you may not want to do that, but if you needed to cancel it, you could cancel it. There's a whole bunch of other things on it, but the target and the type itself, you'll use the target quite a bit because sometimes you need to find out what was actually called, what was clicked on, and maybe you need to do something based on that internally, right? So that's so this is about the event object, and we'll get that in a second. But anyhow, this is a strange thing to get used to and get your eyes used to it because yes, it's a lot to take in. I kind of went over it as well, and this guy can give you some another side to it.
Hi, have you always wanted to learn to code but don't know where to start? Would you like to make...
Howdy campers, welcome to your 10th JavaScript in the DOM tutorial, and in this video I'm going to talk about event bubbling. Alright then, so now you know about events, how to add event listeners to elements and then react to those events. I want to talk about a slightly more advanced concept, and that is event bubbling. So what is event bubbling? Well, in basic terms, it's the bubbling of an event up through the DOM tree. So in the previous tutorial, what we did is attach an event listener to each button, and we're listening for the click event, right? So event bubbling will occur when we click on this button without you necessarily knowing. It always occurs unless you prevent it doing so. So when we click on this button, the event is originating right here. This is the target element, the thing that we're clicking. So if we have an event listener added to this element, which we do right here, we add the event listener for a click. If we do, then it will callback function associated with that event listener. If we don't, that's fine as well. It doesn't matter whether there is one associated with it or not. Either way, what happens next is the event bubbles up to the parent element, in this case the li tag. Now, if we were to have an event listener added to the li tags, then the callback function for this would fire as well. So if we were to say in here, lis.add event listener click, and then inside the callback function alert some kind of message, when we click on this, the delete button, first of all, we'll fire the event for this. Then the event will bubble up to the li, and it will fire the callback function for that, which is an alert. So it will alert something to us in the browser. So whether we have an event listener added to this LI or not, what happens next is the event bubbles up to the UL, and the same process occurs. If we have an event listener added to the UL, that will fire, and then the book list, and then the wrapper, etc. So the event is bubbling up from the target element which we click all the way up to the furthermost parent element. So we can take advantage of this, because right now what we're doing is attaching an event listener to every single span with a class of delete right here. So we're attaching 4 in total. But for 2 reasons, this is not great. The first reason is if we were to add a book later on, in fact, I'll just do this now. I'm going to edit this as HTML and copy the whole lot. Then what I'll do is edit the UL as HTML, and I'll add another LI onto the end. So now we have 5 LIs, right? And we have the delete button still working from the last tutorial. But what if I was to delete, say, this one? It works. If I delete the last one which we added, this does not work because we've already associated the event listeners with each of these buttons. So that's one drawback of this model right here, attaching to every single button. The other drawback is that if we have a lot of these buttons on the page, then it's going to be quite a big task to attach every event listener to every button. Okay, it's a more expensive task, if you like. It takes longer for JavaScript to do. Ideally, what we could do is just attach an event listener to the UL, and that's one element we're attaching it to. Then when we click on the button, the event is going to bubble up to the UL. We can find out the target which was originally clicked, which button. Then we can delete that LI associated with that button. Sounds complex, but it's easier to do, and this is much more efficient. So let's take advantage of this event bubbling to do this. The first thing I want to do is just get rid of all this, and then I'm going to say const list is equal to documents.query selector, and then in the brackets I want to grab the UL which is in the book list, so book-list UL. All right, so now we have this UL and we want to attach an event listener to it. So we'll say list dot add event listener. And what are we adding an event listener of? A click event. So now we can fire a function when this happens, when someone clicks the UL, and in here we'll pass through the event. So inside this function, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we need to find the target which was clicked. Was it the button? Because if someone clicks over here or over here, I don't want to delete the element. I only want to delete if they clicked on a button. So we need to check the target element. Where did the user click? So we'll say if, then in brackets, e.target.class name is equal to delete. And we've not learned about class name at the minute, but this right here will return the class name of the element. And this needs to be target, not target. So target. So when we click on the UL, if the target was the button with a class name of delete, then we're going to do something, right? If not, then we won't. So if we click anywhere except the button on the LI, nothing's going to happen. If we click on the button within the UL, then we're going to do something, right? So inside this if statement, what do we want to do? We want to, first of all, find the LI that's associated with this delete button. So I'm going to say const LI, and that is going to be equal to e.target, so the button that we clicked, dot parent element. So if we click, for example, this button right here, it's going to grab the LI associated with it. So this is the target element which we click. Then we're saying grab the parent element, which is this LI. Okay. So now we have the parent element. What we can do is say li.parent node, and that's going to grab the node above it, or it could be parent element. It doesn't really matter, which is going to be the UL. Then what we're going to do is say dot remove child. And the child is going to be the LI, which we just grabbed right here. Now, instead of saying li.parent node, what we could do is just say list, because that's the UL, right? That's the parent node. So I'm going to say list.remove child li. So now this is going to do exactly the same as before. Let me just save it and refresh. And now if we delete, then everything's still working the same way. And that's because we have an event listener associated with the UL. When we click on the UL, we're making sure that we're clicking on a button first of all. If we are clicking on a button, then we're firing this code where we get the LI associated with it. Then we're removing that LI from the list. If we don't click on the button, like over here somewhere, it's not going to remove it. And this is good because now, if we were to add another LI, so let's just edit this HTML and grab an LI, copy it, and then paste it as well down below. If we were to add another one, now, even though the event listener was not attached to this button, if we click it, it's still going to delete because the event is associated with the UL and we're still clicking on that UL tag and finding the source element. Okay, so this is a much better way to do it than we did before. And now we have successfully deleted the book from the list. So I'm just going to pop a little comment up here called delete books, and we're going to keep this in our application for now because that bit's finished, and we're going to move on through the application and add in the other functionality as we go along.
All right, so that's pretty slick. You can actually do it one time instead of like you said, assigning that event listener to every single button on the fly and generating it. Like that's one reason why, you know, event bubbling would be, you can use it to your advantage, right? Because you could have 100 elements in there. But you got to remember when, you know, as I'm clicking everywhere in this panel, actually that bubbling is happening, right? It's happening everywhere in your HTML. You know, if I'm double clicking, it's only when I click on that element, and in his example, he checks the element, the event.target to see, in fact, that it is the element that he's clicking, right? So if you click the button, you know that it's the button, right? If we change this, to the target, and then you're doing the manipulation with all that node manipulation, right? So here we have that. I guess in his example there, he said, okay, well, I want to console log the event target, the dot parent node, I believe. So if we had dot parent node, if there was one, see what happens there. It might throw an error. So it actually does give the container, right? So it gives that container parent. So if he had, I mean, we have a very simple button here, but if you had like a table row, basically that would turn the row, and you could delete the whole row, and you wouldn't have to worry about attaching events to every single element in your grid. Say for example, you had a music search project, and you had table rows, right? And you wanted to do something to each row. That would be a good scenario where you could add a listener to the top container and then add some cool stuff to it, right? Without having to do it, you know, brute forcing adding the event to every single row in your table, right? It can get really messy. But the more you know how to use this stuff, the easier it can get. But you need to know how to work with this stuff, right? So again, it all comes down to the DOM manipulation, the traversal, and then attaching events to it, and you can come up with some really cool stuff, really. So if we talk about that event object, we already talked about it. It gave the target, but there's a lot of other properties on that event object. To be honest, I can't say that I've used the bubbles too much. Does it bubble? True, if the event bubbles. I haven't really checked that. I mean, cancelable, yes, right? I just assume that most events bubble, but you may need some really, you know, high level JavaScript. You need to keep track of that stuff, whether or not it's cancelable. So basically, by default, you should always be able to cancel that event before it hits the top. The current target, the target that fired the event, we looked at that one. Default prevented. So that we're going to talk about in a minute what that means. Default prevented. You'll run into that code a lot, and if you've done JavaScript before, looked at, you have ran into that, and you're like, I don't know what this means, but it seems that everybody's using it, so I'm going to use it too, and you have no idea why, but you'll find out why. Just the fact that you know about the bubbling and the capturing, you'll understand why you need that. Some more detail about it. Event phase, so you may need to figure out if it's in the capturing phase and the bubbling phase. To be honest, again, I haven't really needed to know that. To be honest, in most applications I worked at, but it's just information on it. Prevent default, yes, you will definitely need this. It basically cancels the default behavior of the event. Stop propagation, yes, you will need this as well. It cancels bubbling. It cancels it right away. So I'll show you some examples on why. Those two especially, you will see quite a bit, and you will use them. You will also use them in React. It's just, it handles that whole diagram in a way that gives you control to allow it, to prevent it from going all the way to the top, because you may not want that. The target, we already looked at that, and the type. You might want to know what type of event, which is a click event. And that's what that previous code example was about. So to prevent default behavior, so if you want to prevent that default behavior, you would use something like this. So, and I'll show you this. I'll show you an example in a second, right? When you have that event triggering and the handle has access to that event object, so you may want to stop the default behavior. So the method tells the user agent, which is the browser, that if the event does not get explicitly handled, its default action should not be taken as it normally would. So you basically stop the default behavior. Let me look at that before I get into this one. So I had an example here called prevent default. All right. So a very good example of this would be not only on the form that you might want to suppress the form from submitting and handle validation. So if I have a link, if I look at that, it's just a link as we would normally suspect a hyperlink to look. It's an href tag like this. It goes to George Brown. When we click it, what's going to happen is we may not want to navigate away. So if I click on this, it'll click and it'll redirect me entirely to George Brown. That tells us that campuses are closed and distance learning courses are continued. Okay, yes, so we are in a distance learning course, but it's closed. Important dates. Intersession coming up. That's good to know. All right, classes begin. Okay, anyhow, you may not want the action to, you may want to do something before, and now it's not letting me go back. Maybe they're preventing, okay. Oh, why would they do that? So maybe I want to do something. Maybe when I click this, I don't want it to navigate away. That's the default behavior of this link, and I don't want to do that. I want to capture the click. Maybe I want to do something, or maybe I don't want to redirect at all. I want to redirect to another college, maybe, but don't do that. So what I could do here is I have this button, which is in the container, and I walk up to it and I use my query selector. So I grabbed it. I add my listener in this way. And am I looking at the right one? No, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong one here. Here's my link. Sorry, my mistake there. Here's a link in the DOM. I walk up to it and I grab the link element with my query selector to grab by the element A. So grabs that. I add an event listener to it, the click element, and I have an anonymous function. But I want to just log the console, or maybe I want to fire one of those alerts to say you clicked me, right? And I don't want to go anywhere else, but right now, even if I refresh this, it probably will show the alert, but then let's see what happens. It showed it, but then if I click OK, it redirects. I don't want that. So now my whole flow is screwed up, right? Because now the default behavior when I click that link is it's posting back to that URL. You can see on the bottom there, it's trying to redirect. It's hung up, but when I click that, I'm gone. So that's terrible, especially for a checkout or something like that. So to prevent that default behavior, they have on that event, there is something called prevent default, which prevents the default behavior and stops it right there. Stops it. And maybe you might want to re-trigger it or something like that later, but you have control now of that click. So if I refresh that now, if I click it, I click OK. Now it stayed there and my console logged clicked. So now I have control of what I want to do here. So you have basically canceled that behavior. You haven't canceled necessarily the bubbling, but you canceled that behavior. And again, when you look at this code here, it may be confusing to you a little bit, but so this is the inline function here, and you may look at that and be like, I don't like that. So you can certainly create your own function here. If we had a named function, if you wanted to say, I don't know, click me equals to a function like this. So actually we can just copy paste all of that. We can actually cut all of this out. And we can put this here if you want to clean it up a little bit for yourself. make it look better. And you could just, by reference, put click me in there like that. Is that right? Let me see here. By reference, it should be right. Let's see. Click me. Yes. So if you notice, I didn't invoke it. I didn't invoke it like that. I didn't pass in anything, because then right there it won't work. It's by reference. So if now I have an error here. It says it says it's not defined. So I passed it by reference in there. So maybe that is more cleaner for you. It looks better to you, right? You basically added this. So again, add listener doesn't need to be, if this is confusing to you, there's also those other older methods. This is link.onClick, right? And there's a whole bunch of other ones. OnClick could equal that click me now as well. You could do it like that. So we could do it in the same way in another syntax. So if I click it, so in the same way, it looks like that. So if you wanted to clean all of that up, maybe you don't like how the inline function works, you could just certainly do that. And then if you wanted to, by the way, if somewhere down the line you wanted to just cancel that listener, the old school way would be like you could just onClick equals to null, and then basically now after it runs, it probably won't be clickable anymore, right? Now it has the default behavior because I blew away the listener. I blew away that handler by doing that. So anyhow, you will see that a lot, and you will not know why. Well, you may not have known why, but now you understand, and it's in most JavaScript. Again, if you need to look at the reference on this one, it is worth looking at this one a little bit further. You'll use it quite a bit. Again, some other examples on it. The browser capabilities, compatibilities, right? Yeah. IE9. All right, so IE5 is not supported, so you might have to use something else. Yeah, so this is stop propagation, right? So I'm almost done, and then we'll look at the lab. Let's look at that was prevent default. I'm sorry. This is stop propagation. So this is another one that you're going to need in a second. I may be interrupted. Hold on. Is there a Roblox emergency or Minecraft? I'm not sure. I'm bribing everybody with Minecoins and Robux these days just to allow me to do this with you guys. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up quickly. They're calling for me, but event stop propagation. So this is another one. So this one will stop the event in the capturing and bubbling phases. So you will see this everywhere, and you will have no idea why it's in the code, but you'll understand in a second. So any default behaviors occurring in those clicks, you don't want maybe that click to bubble up to the top, because maybe there's listeners at the top that are going to do something weird, and you want to stop that bubbling process, right? So I have an example on bubbling. Let me see what I did there for this one. Good old button here, sitting here, I'm going to click it. So really, it's probably just going to demonstrate that if I click it, what's going to happen here? Is it going to throw an error on me? The button was clicked. If you see now, it's not traveling up the tree. So I think I just have I have this going on, right? So if I don't include the stop propagation, then the next parent, which is the body I've added a listener to, it's going to bubble up to that guy. So if you see the button was clicked and the body was clicked, and I'm sure if I added the document and the window, they would both be clicked. However, I stop propagation right there, right after he's clicked. So therefore, he is not going to be, it's not going to bubble up to the top, and you have control again if you're doing something else. So anyhow, that's a lot to take in. I'm not going to lie, but it's good to know. Let me just stop recording here, and we'll get you